When the sword is pointing down, it signifies no justice. It is the corporation speaking, and not the Department of Justice, created by the politicians who carried out the will of the people. Australia has been destroyed by criminal politicians. This video demonstrates the destruction, the willful destruction, of the manufacturing industry in a country that one time produced oil. The third largest in the world. Now we've got nothing left but destruction. And lack of hope. One nation is the only hope we have. We need to make a start to get rid of Victoria's criminal element ASP.
10:45 a.m. Friday, 20th of October 2017. The Holden Elizabeth Assembly Line. A red VF Commodore SSV red line, VSN ending 33354R2, rolls off the line. The last Australian-made Holden ever built. The workers gather. Some cry. The factory had been building Australian cars there since 1963. Hard cut backwards. Tuesday, 28th of October 1941. CAC Lidcombe, Sydney. The first Australian-assembled Pratt & Whitney twin Wasp engine completes assembly. Lawrence Wackett's CAC team did it anyway. Australia would build 870 of them across the war. In 1942, Australian factories armed every Australian rifle in the Pacific. In 2017, the last Australian-made car rolled off the Holden Elizabeth line. Between those two dates, Australia deliberately destroyed every capability that built the first. This is not the story of how Australian manufacturing died. This is the story of how Australia killed it. Chapter 1. I Am Work. 3rd of September 1939. Robert Menzies stands at a microphone and tells Australia what he must tell it. It is my melancholy duty to inform you officially that in consequence of a persistence by Germany in her invasion of Poland, Great Britain has declared war upon her and that, as a result, Australia is also at war. Australia is not prepared. The Royal Australian Air Force has fewer than 250 frontline aircraft, almost all of British design. The Australian Imperial Force is still equipped with the Lee Enfield rifle, a design from 1907. The Royal Australian Navy has 6 cruisers, 5 destroyers, 3 sloops. The country imports almost everything it cannot grow. In Melbourne, a 58-year-old steel and mining executive named Essington Lewis reads the news at BHP. Lewis is the most successful Australian industrialist of his generation. Born in Burra, South Australia, in 1881. He joined BHP at the start of the century, General Manager by 1921, Managing Director by 1926, Chief General Manager by 1938. He had been to Germany in 1934. He had been to Japan in 1935. He had come back and told the Australian government, on record, that war was coming. The Australian government had largely ignored him. May 1940. Robert Menzies summons Lewis to Canberra. He offers him a role that has never existed in Australian government before. Director General of Munitions. Lewis accepts. He refuses to be paid. He uses BHP aircraft, BHP cars, BHP personal staff. He commutes between Melbourne and Canberra on BHP aircraft. Here's the thing. The role Menzies offered Lewis was unprecedented in Australian political history. His charter would be described as, quote, as wide as the seas and as high as the sky. He had ultimate control over the production of all ordnance, all explosives, all ammunition, all small arms, all aircraft, all vehicles, and all the machine tools used to make them. In his department office, in a Melbourne building requisitioned for the war, Lewis hung a framed sign on the wall. 3 words, 2 letters each. I am work. 11th of June, 1940. The Department of Munitions is formally established. 8 directorates. The Directorate of Machine Tools and Gauges would commission the lathes from Hercus in Adelaide and the presses from John Hine and Son in Sydney. Lewis sits above all of them. Between 1942 and 2017, the country that armed itself with Essington Lewis would dismantle the capability he built across the next 5 years. This is how he built it. Chapter 2. The machines that made the bullets. By midnight on the 11th of June 1940, Essington Lewis had a department, a charter and a deadline that no one had calculated. The fall of France in May had cut Australia off from the European arms makers it had been counting on. The British were rationing every machine tool, every gauge, every barrel of gun steel. The Pacific was 18 months from being at war. What he had in his hands was a country with no aircraft engine industry, no machine tool industry at scale, no ammunition industry at military calibre, no precision optical industry, and no naval gun industry. What he had on paper was an Act of Parliament telling him to build them. He built them. November 1940. Hendon Small Arms Ammunition Factory opens in Adelaide. Capacity 100 million rounds of .303 rifle ammunition per year. Head stamps MH and MJ. The cartridge case presses, the dies, the precision gauges that made the brass to military calibre. Built by John Hine and son of Sydney and W. G. A. Goetz and Sons. February 1941. Finsbury Cartridge Case Factory opens in South Australia, 4th of March 1941. The Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation opens an engine plant at Lidcombe, in Western Sydney, 28th of October 1941. Lawrence Wackett's team completes assembly on the first Australian-built Pratt & Whitney Twin Wasp engine. By the end of the war, Lidcombe would have built 870 of them. Lithgow Small Arms Factory expands. Maribyrnong Munitions works in Melbourne expands. Footscray Ammunition Factory in Melbourne, the original Australian small arms ammunition factory from 1888. Expands to a workforce of approximately 6,000, with head stamp MF. A new factory at Rocklea in Queensland, head stamp MQ, produces approximately 150 million rounds across the war and over 1 million 25-pounder cartridge cases. WILFUL in Perth, head stamp MW. At the Maribyrnong Peak, 20,000 men and women work the factory floor. 52% of them are women. Let that number sit for a moment. In 1943, more than half of the workers in the Australian munitions industry were women. The country that had not let women vote in some state elections 40 years earlier now armed the Pacific from a factory floor that was majority female. Charles Ruwalt of Richmond, Victoria, makes gun howitzers and tank attack guns and mortar bombs. Perry Engineering of Adelaide makes munitions and ferret scout cars and 75-foot tugs. Thompson's of Castlemaine makes 25-pounder recuperators and cannon and crankshafts. F.W. Hercus of Adelaide produces in excess of 2,300 machine tools across the war. The Ford assembly line at Geelong, which had built Model A cars and Model T cars, manufactures 12,561 British Mark 14 Maud C mines between 1941 and 1944. The mines are laid by HMAS Bungari. The main charge, 227 kilograms of TAINT, is made at Maribyrnong. The government aircraft factories build 700 Beauforts across 6 states. The Beaufort is widely described as Australia's greatest wartime manufacturing achievement. At peak in 1943, the Australian munitions industry employs 60,000 workers, 1/3 of them in Victoria, over half of them women. The country had no manufacturing of substance in 1939. By 1943, it was arming the Pacific. The capability Lewis built took 5 years. Chapter 3. The country that armed the Pacific. 19th of February, 1942. 242 Japanese aircraft attacked Darwin in 2 waves. 188 from Vice Admiral Nagumo's Kiddo Butai carrier strike force. 54 from land-based bombers. 236 Australians and Allied service members are killed. The Pacific War arrives on Australian soil. The Australian rifles that fire back at the attacking aircraft are firing brass made in Adelaide, on presses built in Sydney, on production lines designed by Lewis's department, in the Western Desert, at Tobruk, on the Kokoda track, at Milne Bay, at Boona, at Sanananda, at Borneo. The Australian Imperial Force fires ammunition from Maribyrnong, from Footscray, from Hendon, from Rocklea, from Welshpool. The rifles are made at Lithgow, the mortars are made at Bendigo. The Beauforts overhead are built across the government aircraft factories. The engines in the Beauforts are built at CAC Lidcombe. 24th of September 1943. Essington Lewis is appointed Companion of Honour. He becomes the first Australian, other than a Prime Minister, admitted to the order. The honour cites his services to industry. He is 62 years old, 1943 to 44. The Australian Army has been so denuded by the demand for civilian industrial labour that the Curtin government discharges 100,000 men from the Army to return them to munitions factories. The Australian Army is shrinking so that Australian factories can produce. Read that again. The Curtin government discharged 100,000 men from the Australian Army to return them to munitions factories. Not because the Army didn't need them, because the factories needed them more. By 1945, Australia is one of the largest munitions producers in the British Commonwealth. The country builds aircraft engines, Seamanner, anti-tank guns, 25-pounders, Beauforts, boomerangs, Wirraways, machine tools, optical equipment, radar, naval vessels, and almost every component of the war effort except the heaviest bombers and the largest battleships. A country of 7 million people built that. A country of 7 million people, 500,000 of whose able-bodied men were in uniform, half of whose factory workers were women, almost none of whose industrial capacity had existed 5 years earlier. Lewis travelled between Canberra and the factories on BHP aircraft. He inspected production lines. He sacked managers who could not meet targets. He commissioned new factories on his own authority. He worked 7 days a week. The frame sign on his office wall, 3 words, remained where it had been since June 1940. I am work. By 1945, Essington Lewis had built the most industrially sovereign Australia in the country's history. Between 1942 and 2017, every single capability he built would be deliberately dismantled. The dismantling did not begin with Whitlam. It began with the question of what to do with the wartime industrial economy after the war ended. Lewis stayed at BHP, the factories stayed open. The Country Party leader, who would defend the wartime capability for the next 25 years, was named John McEwen. Chapter 4. Protection all round, 1945. The war ends. The wartime industrial expansion does not end. The Australian government, under Curtin, then Chifley, then Menzies, decides the capability built between 1940 and 1945 will not be unwound. Robert Menzies returns as Prime Minister in 1949. He governs for 16 straight years. Behind him, in the Country Party, a Victorian dairy farmer named John Blackjack McEwen rises through the ranks. Country Party leader from 1958, Minister for Commerce and Agriculture from 1949, Minister for Trade from 1956, Minister for Trade and Industry from 1963, Deputy Prime Minister from 1958 until 1971. Caretaker, Prime Minister for 23 days from the 19th of December 1967, after Harold Holt drowned at Cheviot Beach. McEwen's doctrine had a name. Protection all round. Australian manufacturing would be protected by high tariffs on imported manufactured goods. Australian primary industries, wool, wheat, beef, dairy, would be protected by guaranteed prices and orderly marketing. The Country Party traded farm protection for industrial protection. Here's the thing. The McEwen settlement made Australia the most thoroughly tariff-protected manufacturing economy in the Western world. The Tariff Board reviewed each industry application case by case. Tariffs on motor vehicles reached 45%, on clothing 55%, on machine tools comparable. Australia had built a wall around its factories. Behind the wall, General Motors Holden at Fisherman's Bend in Melbourne, Ford at Geelong. The British Motor Corporation in Sydney, white goods makers, Email, Kelvinator, Westinghouse, Pope. Sheet metal manufacturers like John Hine of Sydney. Machine tool makers like F.W. Hercules in Adelaide. Australian-owned breweries, textile mills, glassworks. The Holden FX rolled off the Fisherman's Bend line for the first time in November 1948. Australia's first mass-produced car, designed in Australia, built in Australia, badged in Australia. The protected economy did not simply preserve Lewis's wartime factories. It built new ones. Manufacturing in 1962 is 25% of Australian gross domestic product. Nearly one-third of Australia's workforce works in a factory or workshop. Australian apprenticeships are administered through state industrial training boards. Australian sheet metal workers, fitters and turners, machinists and tool makers are trained in numbers that match the demand of the protected economy. 2nd of October, 1961. Essington Lewis dies at his Tallarook property in Victoria. He is 80 years old. The Department of Munitions he built has by then been folded into the Department of Supply. His tenure as Director General of Munitions had ended 15 years earlier. He did not see what came next. He died believing the capability he built would be passed on. In Canberra, in May 1963, the McEwen settlement faced its first serious internal critic. The Tariff Board appointed a new chairman that month. His name was G.A. Alf Rattigan. Rattigan would not say so publicly for nearly a decade. But from his appointment in May 1963, the intellectual case for dismantling the McEwen Wall began to be built. Inside the very institution Menzies and McEwen had created to defend it. Between 1942 and 2017, the dismantling would take 44 years. It began in earnest in 1973. But the architecture of demolition was drawn up inside the Tariff Board 10 years earlier. Chapter 5, 7 p.m., 27th of June, 1973. A four-man committee is appointed in secret. The Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam, signs the order personally. The committee is told to meet at an obscure location to avoid press attention. The chairman was G.A. Alf Rattigan, Tariff Board Chairman, 10 years into a quiet intellectual campaign against the McEwen settlement. The members included Professor Fred Gruen of the Australian National University, consulting economist to the Prime Minister. He was a free trade advocate since the early 1960s. Another member was Brian Brogan of Monash University, consulting economist to the Minister for Overseas Trade and Secondary Industry. Another member was Dr. Stuart Harris, Deputy Secretary, Department of Overseas Trade. The Australian Treasury knows nothing. The Department of the Treasury, the Central Economic Department of the Commonwealth Government, the keeper of the national accounts, is deliberately excluded from the committee's deliberations. Treasury Deputy Head John Stone would later confirm that Treasury knew nothing of what was unfolding. The committee meets in July. It recommends an immediate blanket reduction in Australian tariffs. 7 p.m. Wednesday, 18th of July, 1973. Prime Minister Gough Whitlam and Minister for Overseas Trade and Secondary Industry. Dr. Jim Cairns issue a joint statement. Each tariff will be reduced by 1/4 of what it is now, excluding revenue items, excluding anti-dumping duties, applying forthwith, effective from midnight, 5 hours notice. Read that again. The Australian government, on a Wednesday evening, with 5 hours' notice, cut every protected Australian manufacturer's protection by 25% across the board. Cabinet did not consult Treasury. Cabinet did not consult industry. Cabinet did not consult the relevant Senate committee. The rationale was inflation. Australian inflation had reached 14% by mid-1973. The committee's argument was that imported competition would discipline domestic prices. The argument was wrong. General Motors Holden stood down 5,000 workers within 48 hours and demanded immediate tariff restoration. Cabinet capitulated within weeks. The motor vehicle tariff was restored to 45%. An 80-20 import quota was imposed, and a compromise was struck to keep GMH at Fisherman's Bend. But across the rest of Australian manufacturing, outside the political weight of the automotive industry, the cut held. Between 1973 and 1980, Australian manufacturing employment fell by 80,000 jobs. Fewer than 6,000 of those workers claimed wage replacement support within 15 months. The disruption fell almost entirely on the workers themselves. 1st of January 1974. The Industries Assistance Commission Act takes effect. The Tariff Board is abolished. The IAC replaces it. The new body, championed by Rattigan, would recommend further reductions in industry protection. 26 years into the 75 years between 1942 and 2017, the first deliberate cut had been made. It would not be the last. It would not be reversed. Hit subscribe before we get to the part where Labor and Liberal traded power 4 times across 30 years, and every government from 1983 to 2017 continued cutting tariffs. The part where Bob Hawke told the Australian Parliament in Hansard that his government had deliberately and determinedly set about pulling down the tariff walls. The part where 8 Prime Ministers and 44 years after Whitlam's first cut, the Australian car industry no longer existed. Subscribe before you scroll. Chapter 6. The Button Plan. 11th of March, 1983. Bob Hawke is sworn in as Prime Minister of Australia. Paul Keating and becomes Treasurer. Senator John Button, a Victorian Labor lawyer, becomes Minister for Industry, Technology and Commerce. Button is 49 years old. He has been in the Senate since 1974. He is widely regarded as the most committed industry minister Australia has had since John McEwen. He is also the most committed to dismantling the McEwen settlement. The Hawke Cabinet decides, within its first year, that Australian industry policy is broken. The Whitlam cut of 1973 was a sledgehammer. What Hawke and Keating want is a scalpel. They want industry-by-industry plans on legislated schedules with named end states. 30th of May 1984. Button announces the Motor Industry Development Plan to the Senate. The plan will become known by his name. The Button Car Plan. The schedule. Passenger vehicle tariff to fall from 57.5% in 1985 to 15% by the year 2000. 2.5 percentage points per year. Import quotas abolished. 13 locally made models to be reduced to 6. 6 models to be produced by 3 groups. Button delivers parallel plans for steel, for textiles, clothing and footwear, for heavy engineering. Australian industrial protection is being unwound by named ministerial statement and legislated calendar, May 1988. A midterm review of the Button Car Plan accelerates the cuts. The motor vehicle tariff drops from 57.5% to 45%, effective the 1st of July 1988. The schedule to 15% by the year 2000 is maintained. 22nd of November 1989. Prime Minister Hawke launches a white paper commissioned the previous year from his former principal economic advisor, Professor Ross Garnaut of the Australian National University. The title, Australia and the Northeast Asian Ascendancy. The Garnaut Report would become the philosophical foundation of every Australian tariff cut for the next 15 years. Its thesis: Australia's economic future was as a services and resources exporter integrated into the rising Asian economic order. Manufacturing, the report argued, was no longer Australia's comparative advantage, and this is where it gets genuinely insane. The Australian government had spent the previous 5 years dismantling the tariffs that protected Australian manufacturing. It then commissioned an academic report from its own former advisor to provide the philosophical justification for what it had already done. The report became the document the next 4 governments would cite to justify continuing the cuts. 47 years into the 75 years between 1942 and 2017, the deliberate dismantling had a philosophical document attached to it. The next year, 1991, Prime Minister Hawke would stand at the dispatch box of the House of Representatives and deliver a ministerial statement that put the verb of this video into Hansard. The statement was called Building a Competitive Australia. The verb was deliberately. Chapter 7. Pulling Down the Tariff Walls. 12th of March 1991. The House of Representatives. Prime Minister Bob Hawke rises at the dispatch box to deliver a ministerial statement. The statement is titled Building a Competitive Australia. The verbatim Hansard sentence, the one that gives this video its title verb. Right from the start, this government deliberately and determinedly set about pulling down the tariff walls. By 1992, our existing programs will have slashed the nominal rate of assistance to the manufacturing sector by over 1/3, from 13 to 8%, and the effective rate from 22 to 12%. Read it again. Deliberately, determinedly, pulling down. That is the Australian Prime Minister's own verb. Hansard recorded it. The parliamentary record confirms it. The verb of the title of this video is the verb the man who cut the tariffs used in Parliament to describe the act of cutting them. The Hawke statement was a package. Further tariff cuts beyond the button plan schedule, new apprentice support programs, the clever country framing. Treasurer Paul Keating delivered a detailed budgetary portfolio statement the same day. Senator John Button delivered an industry portfolio statement. 49 years into the 75 years between 1942 and 2017, the dismantling had been declared, in Hansard, to be deliberate. By the end of 1991, Paul Keating had succeeded Bob Hawke as Prime Minister. The dismantling continued. By the year 2000, the average effective rate of assistance to Australian manufacturing was below 5%. The button car plan schedule was on target. Australian apprenticeships had peaked at 161,000 in 1990. By 1994, 4 years later, the number had fallen to 131,000. 30,000 fewer apprentices in 4 years. The cultural shift was as fast as the economic shift. The Dawkins higher education reforms of 1988 had converted the colleges of advanced education into universities. A generation of Australian school leavers who would have gone into apprenticeships in 1970 were now expected to go to university by 1990. The Australian manufacturing workforce that John Heine, F.W. Hercus and Essington Lewis had built, the sheet metal workers, the toolmakers, the fitters and turners, the machinists, was disappearing as fast as the tariffs that had supported the wages they were paid. The verb was deliberately. The next government to confirm it would be John Howard's. Chapter 8. The Productivity Commission. 11th of March, 1996. John Howard's coalition government takes office, defeating Paul Keating's Labor government by a landslide. Howard governs until December 2007. The Hawke-Keating tariff demolition program is inherited, not reversed. Howard does not restore the McEwen settlement. Howard completes the Hawke-Keating program. 8th of December, 1998. The Productivity Commission Act 1998 comes into force. The Productivity Commission is established. It merges the Industries Assistance Commission, the Bureau of Industry Economics, and the Economic Planning Advisory Council. The three institutions that had administered Australian tariff dismantling for the previous 25 years are consolidated into a single statutory body. The Productivity Commission becomes the institutional engine of Australian deindustrialisation. Its inquiries, automotive, textiles, dairy, steel, telecommunications, pharmaceuticals, recommend continued reductions in industry assistance. The PC reports become the document's subsequent government cite to justify further cuts. Let that number sit for a moment. By 2001, the Australian average effective rate of assistance to manufacturing had reached the 5% target Keating had projected in his 1991 statement. The protected Australian manufacturing economy that Essington Lewis had armed in the war and John McEwen had defended for 25 years was functionally over. 18th of May, 2005. The Australia and United States Free Trade Agreement takes effect. Australian tariffs on American manufactured goods are abolished or reduced to zero on a wide range of categories. Across the 11.5 years of Howard's Prime Ministership, the Australian manufacturing share of gross domestic product falls from approximately 13% to approximately 9%. The Australian car industry by then has been operating under the Button Plan schedule for 20 years. Holden, Ford and Toyota, the three remaining Australian manufacturers, have between them reduced from 15 locally produced models to fewer than 6. Mitsubishi at Tonsley Park in Adelaide is operating on declining production volumes. 24th of November 2007, John Howard loses the federal election. Kevin Rudd is sworn in as Prime Minister. The Howard government's tariff program, by then a bipartisan program continuous from Whitlam, is complete. 65 years into the 75 years between 1942 and 2017, the Australian manufacturing capability Lewis built had been reduced to its final automotive remnant. The next government, Rudd Labor, would preside over the closure of Mitsubishi at Tonsley Park in Adelaide. 5th of February 2008. Mitsubishi Motors Australia Chief Executive Rob McEnery announces the closure. 27th of March 2008. The last Mitsubishi 380 rolls off the Tonsley line. 930 jobs lost. The plant had accumulated approximately $1.5 billion Australian dollars in losses across the previous decade. 11th of December 2009. Prime Minister Kevin Rudd drives the first locally manufactured Toyota Camry hybrid off the Altona production line in Melbourne. The car was symbolic. The future of Australian car manufacturing was not. March 2012. Holden is given a $270 million Australian dollar co-investment package from the federal, South Australian and Victorian governments. In return, Holden commits to $1 billion of plant investment and Australian manufacturing through at least 2022. The Holden chairman and chief executive is Mike Devereaux. The government, after Rudd, Gillard Labor, would commission the Productivity Commission inquiry that would justify the next government's role in the rest. The next government after Gillard, the Abbott coalition government, would be in office on the day the Australian car industry was told to leave. The treasurer who told it to leave was Joseph Benedict Hockey. Chapter 9. Come Clean, 9th of December 2013. Canberra. Mike Devereaux, the chairman of Holden Australia, appears before the Productivity Commission's Automotive Manufacturing Inquiry. He tells the inquiry, on the record, that no decision has been made about Holden's future in Australia. He leaves the hearing. That same evening, Devereaux joins a teleconference with General Motors Detroit. The call confirms what Devereaux had just denied to the Productivity Commission. GM has decided to close Holden Australian manufacturing. 10th of December 2013. Tony Abbott, the Prime Minister, is in South Africa attending the memorial service for Nelson Mandela. Deputy Prime Minister Warren Truss is acting. Treasurer Joe Hockey is in Canberra. Hockey rises in the House of Representatives during question time. He demands that GM Holden, in his words, come clean with the Australian people. He puts the question directly. Either you're here or you're not. Truss writes to Devereux, demanding immediate clarification. 11th of December 2013. GM Detroit issues a media release. The headline, GM to transition to a national sales company in Australia and New Zealand. The body of the release, company to cease manufacturing in Australia by 2017. Affected positions, approximately 2,900 over 4 years. 1,600 in South Australia. 1,300 in Victoria. GM Chairman and CEO Dan Ackerson. We are completely dedicated to strengthening our global operations while meeting the needs of our customers. Industry Minister Ian Macfarlane. I am deeply disappointed by Holden's decision to end car manufacturing in Australia from 2017. Here's the kicker. The Productivity Commission inquiry, whose terms of reference Joe Hockey had signed only weeks earlier under Parts 2 and 3 of the Productivity Commission Act of 1998, would deliver its interim report 9 days later. Its final report on the 31st of March 2014. The PC's Automotive Manufacturing Inquiry was report number 70. Presiding Commissioner Michael Woods. Commissioner Philip Weikart. The report's central finding, in its own words, decades of transitional assistance to automotive manufacturing firms, $30 billion between 1997 and 2012, has forestalled but not prevented the significant structural change. The report justifies what has already been decided. 10th of February 2014. Toyota Australia announces it will cease Australian manufacturing in 2017. 23rd of May 2013, 6 months earlier, Ford Australia had already announced its own 2016 closure. 3 companies, 3 closures, 1 Productivity Commission inquiry, 71 years into the 75 years between 1942 and 2017. The Australian car industry had 4 years to live. Chapter 10, The Last Cars, October 2016, Ford Geelong. The Falcon and Territory assembly lines run for the last time. Ford had announced the closure in May 2013, 3.5 years earlier. The workforce had been wound down progressively. The last Australian Ford rolled off the line in October, 3rd of October 2017. Toyota Altona, the last Australian-built Camry, rolls off the line. Across the 22 years of Toyota Australian manufacturing, the Altona plant had built 2,168,104 Camrys, including 50,296 hybrids. It had built 2,535,963 locally manufactured engines. It had exported 1,324,991 vehicles. 2017, 10:45 a.m., Friday, 20th of October, Holden, Elizabeth. The assembly line runs for the last time. A red VF Commodore SSV red line rolls off the General Assembly. VIN ending 333542. The last Australian-made Holden Commodore. The last Australian-made Holden of any kind. The workforce at the ceremony is smaller than the workforce that had built the same line in 1963. At its peak in the 1980s, Holden Elizabeth had employed approximately 6,000 people. At the ceremony on the 20th of October 2017, the active workforce is fewer than 700. The Commodore is moved that afternoon to the National Motor Museum at Birdwood in the Adelaide Hills. It will be a museum piece by Christmas. And this is where it gets genuinely insane. Across the 75 years between 1942 and 2017, Holden Elizabeth had built nearly 7,700,000 Australian vehicles. Toyota Altona had built over 2 million Camrys. Ford Geelong had built generations of Falcons, Territories and engines. 2014 Productivity Commission report number 70 had documented $30 billion in transitional assistance to the automotive industry between 1997 and 2012. The Australian government had spent $30 billion to forestall a decision that, when made, took 4 years to execute and 1 cabinet minute to authorise. Read that again. The Australian government spent $30 billion to forestall the closure of the Australian car industry. Then, in December 2013, the Treasurer of Australia told the chairman of the largest of the 3 remaining manufacturers to come clean and to say whether you're here or you're not. The chairman left the country within months. The factories closed within 4 years. The $30 billion in subsidies became, in the Productivity Commission's own words, money that forestalled but did not prevent the dismantling. 3 plants, 3 Octobers, 3 closures, 75 years from the Lidcombe engine line that had built the sovereignty Australia was now retiring. The last Australian-made Commodore was driven into the National Motor Museum. The capability that built the Pacific War was gone. Chapter 11. What Australia Leaves. 2024. Australian manufacturing is 5.4% of gross domestic product. That is the smallest manufacturing share in the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development. 2024. Kainos, Australia's last major plastics manufacturer, closes. February 2025. Oceania Glass, after 169 years of continuous operation, closes. 11th of January 2024. John Hine and Son, the Sydney engineering firm that equipped Hendon Small Arms Ammunition Factory in November 1940, signs members' voluntary liquidation papers. 5 generations, 137 years. 1987. F.W. Hercus of Adelaide, the lathe maker that built 2,300 machine tools for Lewis's Department of Munitions, is sold to the Durden Group. Machine tool production ceases by 2005. The factories that armed the Pacific are gone. Sold, dispersed, demolished. Essington Lewis died in 1961. He did not see the cuts. He did not see the Holden line at Elizabeth shut down at 10:45 a.m. on the 20th of October 2017. He died believing the Australian industrial sovereignty he built between 1940 and 1945 would be passed on. It was not passed on. It was deliberately dismantled. Lesson 1. Australia armed itself. Then Australia disarmed itself. Both decisions were deliberate. In 1944, the Curtin government discharged 100,000 men from the army to return them to munitions factories. In December 2013, the Abbott government's treasurer dared the last major car manufacturer to leave. Both decisions were signed by Australian Prime Ministers in Australian offices on Australian dates. Lesson 2. The destruction was bipartisan, documented and voluntary. There was no foreign hand. Whitlam Labor cut tariffs in 1973. Fraser Liberal did not reverse. Hawke-Keating Labor cut deeper in 1988 and 1991. Howard Liberal completed the program through 2001. Rudd-Gillard Labor presided over Mitsubishi's closure in 2008. Abbott Liberal dared Holden to leave in December 2013. 8 Prime Ministers, 4 parties, 1 outcome. Lesson 3. A country that forgets how to make things forgets how to defend them. The 2020 COVID supply chain reckoning revealed a country that could not domestically manufacture surgical masks, ventilators or pharmaceuticals at the scale a pandemic required. The 2021 AUKUS announcement revealed a country that needed allied partners to build its next generation of submarines. The Sovereignty Lewis built in 5 years took 44 years to dismantle. 8 Australian Prime Ministers personally signed the documents that did it. 4 Australian political parties voted for them. Not one of them stood up in the House of Representatives between July 1973 and December 2013 to say the dismantling was unwise. The bipartisan consensus held. The capability did not. It is unlikely to be rebuilt in this generation. The Holden plant at Elizabeth has been demolished. The site is being redeveloped. The Toyota plant at Altona has been sold. The Ford plant at Geelong has been converted to logistics. Between 1942 and 2017, the country that armed the Pacific deliberately destroyed every capability that built the first. The country that armed the Pacific in 1942 did not, in 2017, ask any successor to make the next.